5 true scary stories from the dark forest, uncovering chilling secrets. A group of close friends had ventured deep into the heart of the forest to escape the bustle of city life, seeking the thrill of a weekend camping trip away from it all. They picked a secluded spot well off the trail, surrounded by towering trees with thick, gnarled branches. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and gray, they gathered around a crackling campfire. The air was crisp and carried a bite that only October evenings seemed to have. It was one of those perfect autumn nights, with leaves in shades of fiery red, burnt orange, and dusky brown carpeting the ground around them. These leaves rustled underfoot and fell gently from above, creating a vibrant, yet ominous backdrop. The campsite felt enveloped by the season itself, as though the forest was watching and waiting with bated breath. The moon, partially obscured by thick clouds, cast faint, fleeting shadows. It peeked out now and again, painting the scene in an otherworldly light before retreating back behind its cloak of clouds. With each gust of wind, the bare branches creaked, and the air filled with the sharp scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. The group of friends laughed and shared stories, some attempting to outdo each other with tales of adventure or childhood mischief, but the conversation always seemed to circle back to a single, unspoken tension. As the night deepened, a shared sense of unease settled over them, subtle but unmistakable. It was as if the forest was listening, joining in on their whispers. Their words were absorbed by the dark woods around them, which seemed to lean in closer as they spoke, attentive to their presence. They'd all heard rumors about this forest, about how it held secrets that didn't welcome intruders. Whispers of strange sightings, eerie sounds, and people who had gone missing under inexplicable circumstances had followed them for years. Locals told stories of campers who had ventured too far, of ghostly apparitions that appeared by moonlight, of unexplained footprints that led into the woods and never back out. Despite their unease, they found comfort in each other's company, laughing off the legends as mere tales for the gullible. But there was an undeniable weight in the air, an inexplicable feeling that they weren't alone. The kind of feeling that makes you glance over your shoulder, even when you know no one should be there. One friend, Eric, who had been sitting quietly for most of the evening, seemed particularly uneasy. He had always been the skeptic, the one who rolled his eyes at ghost stories and dismissed local legends as superstitions for those who needed something to fear. Yet, tonight, he seemed different, quiet, almost subdued. He glanced into the shadows, his gaze lingering on the tree line, as if he could see something the others couldn't. Finally, Eric cleared his throat, breaking the chatter around the fire. His voice was softer than usual, almost reverent. "You know," he began, choosing his words carefully, "there's something strange about this forest. I heard that people who camp here, they don't always leave." The others exchanged glances, some laughing nervously, but Eric remained serious. He leaned forward, his face half lit by the flickering flames, casting shadows that made him look far older, almost haunted. "There's a history here," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "People say this place is cursed, that those who step into these woods often find something they didn't expect, and not all of them make it back." His words hung in the air, weaving a sense of dread that seemed to seep into their bones. The fire crackled loudly, as though punctuating his statement, and a chilly breeze swept through the camp, causing a few of them to shiver despite their best efforts to laugh it off. Sarah, the most lighthearted of the group, forced a smile. "All right, Eric, nice try. We're supposed to be having fun, not freaking ourselves out." She threw another log onto the fire, the flames leaping up, casting their eerie orange glow across the gathering. But Eric's expression didn't change. His gaze remained fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, his face grave. "I'm not making it up," he said, voice barely above a murmur. "There are people who say they've heard voices in these woods, voices that sound like people they know, people who say they've been followed by shadows." As his words trailed off, an uneasy silence fell over the group. The sound of the crackling fire grew louder in the absence of conversation, and each friend found themselves glancing warily into the darkness. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they all shuffled a bit closer to the fire, drawing comfort from its warmth and light. Despite their bravado, none of them felt truly safe anymore. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the night seemed to grow colder, the darkness pressing in around them. The fire cast dancing shadows over their faces, illuminating the slight glint of fear in their eyes. A shiver passed through them, and one by one, they fell silent, captivated by the unseen horrors Eric's words had conjured. Then, with a sudden surge of courage, or perhaps a desire to break the tension, Sarah smiled nervously and said, "All right, if we're going to scare ourselves silly, we might as well do it right. How about some true stories? Anyone got something good?" One by one, the friends glanced at each other, each seemingly reluctant to start, though not wanting to back down. Finally, Eric shrugged, a slight smirk returning to his face. "I've got one," he said. "Something that actually happened to me." As he spoke, the others leaned in, captivated by the serious tone in his voice, and Eric's story began, ushering them into a night that none of them would ever forget. Story 1: The Shadow in the Woods. The storyteller, Jake, leaned forward, his eyes catching the flickering light of the campfire. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as though he didn't want to disturb the night around them. "It was the last night of our camping trip," he began, his gaze shifting to the forest surrounding them. "We'd been out here a few days, hiking, exploring. On that final night, I offered to gather some extra firewood since we were running low. I figured I'd be fine, just a quick walk, you know? But as soon as I stepped away from the fire and into the trees, I felt it. This strange, prickling feeling like I wasn't alone." The others shifted uncomfortably, glancing into the shadows beyond the firelight. Jake's tone held them captive, each word drawing them deeper into the unsettling memory he was weaving. Jake explained that he'd felt a strange sensation of being followed. "At first, I thought it was just nerves," he admitted, giving a shaky laugh. "The way the trees cast shadows, the rustling leaves. Your mind can play tricks on you, right? But it wasn't long before I knew for sure, something was out there." He continued to walk, hoping to brush off the feeling, but as he picked up his pace, he noticed a movement in the corner of his vision. There, just on the edge of sight, was a shadow. "It wasn't clear at first," he said, his brow furrowing as he remembered. "But the more I walked, the closer it seemed to get, always moving just like me, like a shadow with a mind of its own." The fire crackled as Jake paused, giving his friends a moment to picture the scene. "I stopped, to test it. And the shadow stopped too. I'd take a step, it would take a step. But when I turned my head, it was gone. When I moved forward again, I'd feel it, watching, following." He told them he'd tried calling out, thinking maybe one of his friends had decided to play a prank on him, but there was only silence. "I called out a few times, 'Who's there?' But all I got back was dead silence. No one else was out there." Jake took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the dark trees as though he could still see it there, waiting. "I tried to stay calm," he said, his voice strained, "but every step I took felt like I was getting further away from the campsite and closer to something. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it." His voice dropped to a near whisper, drawing his friends closer. "A shadow, maybe 10 feet away from me, standing still. Not an animal, not one of you. It had no face, no features, just this dark, human-shaped figure blending into the trees. I froze and it didn't move. It just stood there watching me." The storyteller described how he'd felt his blood run cold, his feet rooted in place as he stared at the figure. Panic gripped him, and he backed away, feeling for any kind of solid ground beneath his feet. But as he stumbled, his foot caught on a root, sending him tumbling backward onto the cold forest floor. He winced at the memory. The fall knocked the wind out of me, but the moment I looked up, it was gone. The trees were still, the shadows silent, but that feeling of being watched? It didn't leave. Jake finally made it back to camp, shaken but trying to play it off as if nothing had happened. "I didn't want to scare you all," he admitted, "but I couldn't shake that feeling. Even when I was back here sitting by the fire, I felt it out there, watching. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I expected to see that shadow lurking behind me." The fire crackled and the friends exchanged glances, each feeling that creeping sensation of eyes in the dark. Jake finished his story with a shaky laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe it was all in my head," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe that. "But whatever it was, I've never felt truly alone in the woods again. As Jake fell silent, the group huddled closer to the fire, their eyes darting around the shadows, wondering if they too were being watched by something lurking just beyond the light. Story 2: The Whispering Pines. A hush fell over the group as Mark, another camper, began his story. He leaned forward, eyes darting to the dark pines looming just outside the firelight. "Have you heard about the hiker who disappeared here?" he asked, his voice low. "They say he set out alone, never came back. Some people think he just got lost, but the locals, well, they tell it differently. They say the trees still whisper his name, like they remember him." The friends exchanged uneasy glances, glancing out at the dense pines surrounding the campsite. The wind whistled through the branches, as if echoing Mark's story. Mark's voice grew softer as he recalled his unsettling experience earlier that day. "I went out by myself, just to explore a little. Check out the trails and get some fresh air. It was quiet, peaceful, at least at first." He paused, eyes shadowed with memory. "But as I got deeper into the forest, I started hearing something strange." The group leaned in, captivated. "At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the pines, but it wasn't. It was softer, almost like whispers. I brushed it off, thinking I was just imagining it, but the further I walked, the louder it got." Mark's voice dropped lower, barely above a whisper. "I could make out little bits and pieces, just murmurs at first. They were faint, drifting on the wind, but I swear I heard a voice. It sounded like it was calling someone's name. I couldn't catch all of it, but there was a sense of urgency, like the voices were trying to tell me something." The fire crackled, casting uneasy shadows across the campers' faces as Mark's story intensified. He looked down at his hands as if still shaken by the memory. "Then I heard it. A voice that cut through the others, clear as day, and it said, my name. Not faint, not muddled. It was like someone was standing right next to me, whispering my name in my ear." The group froze, their gazes flicking nervously toward the trees, half expecting to hear their own names carried on the wind. "I stopped dead in my tracks," Mark continued, his voice trembling. "I looked around, but there was no one there. The forest was completely empty. But the whispers, they didn't stop. They grew louder, like more voices had joined in, like a whole crowd of people whispering at once. And they weren't just calling my name, they were muttering things I couldn't understand, like some forgotten language, all jumbled together." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes haunted. The air felt thick, almost electric, like something was pressing down on me. It felt like the trees themselves were alive, and they didn't want me there. Unable to shake the feeling of being surrounded by unseen eyes, Mark did the only thing he could. He turned and bolted back toward the campsite. "I ran as fast as I could, but the whispers, they followed me," he said, his voice still tense with lingering fear. "Every step I took, they were right there, trailing me, calling my name. It wasn't until I broke through the edge of the trees that they finally stopped." The campers sat in stunned silence as Mark finished his story. He cast a wary glance over his shoulder at the forest, the shadows between the pines stretching long and dark in the dim light. "I swear, just before I reached the camp, I heard one last whisper. It was so faint, like a sigh. But I knew it was a warning. The trees don't forget, and maybe they were telling me not to come back." The wind picked up, causing the pine trees around them to rustle and sway. For a moment, it sounded eerily like whispered voices drifting through the night, making the campers shiver and draw closer to the fire. Story 3: The Fire That Went Cold. After a pause, the friend next to Mark, Alex, finally spoke up, their voice trembling slightly. Alex was normally calm and collected, but tonight their hands shook as they reached for the flashlight by their side. "I never wanted to talk about this," they began, glancing around as if something might be listening. "But I can't help feeling like this place reminds me of it. A few years ago, I camped in a spot like this, deep in the forest, with a couple of friends. Everything seemed fine, until the fire went out." The group shifted, uneasy. They could all feel the temperature drop slightly as Alex continued. "The fire was the only thing keeping us warm that night, but at some point, it just died. I can still feel that cold." Alex's voice was barely audible over the crackling fire as they recounted that night. We'd spent hours gathering enough wood, making sure the fire would burn through the night. But when I woke up, it was pitch black, and the fire was nothing but ash. The strange thing was, it hadn't just burned out. It was as if something snuffed it out. There was no smoke, no embers. Just cold, dead ash. They took a shaky breath, glancing nervously at the flames dancing in front of them. I was groggy at first, but then I saw something that jolted me awake. Around our campsite, in the dirt, there were symbols. They looked carved. Not random scratches, but shapes, intricate and unnatural. Like they were etched by someone or something. Circles, lines, strange runes I'd never seen before. The group leaned closer, transfixed. Alex's face was pale, their gaze distant, haunted by the memory. I woke up my friends, and we all stared at those symbols. We had no idea what they meant, but the air around us felt different, heavy, dark. We tried to relight the fire. At first it was just to bring some warmth back. None of us wanted to be left in the dark again. But every time we struck a match, this freezing wind would blow it out. No matter what we did, the flame wouldn't catch. It was as if something was right there, waiting, actively stopping us. A nervous laugh escaped Alex, though there was no humor in their eyes. We were terrified, huddling together in that icy darkness, each one of us too afraid to move. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling our camp. Slow at first, like someone or something was watching us, savoring our fear. But when we shone our flashlights out into the trees, we saw nothing. Just shadows. The campers listened, their breaths shallow, as if they too could feel the weight of those unseen eyes. Alex's voice trembled as they recalled the breaking point. For hours we sat there, shaking, trying not to scream. Every now and then, we'd try to relight the fire, but each time that cold, unearthly wind blew it out. Just before dawn, as the sky finally started to lighten, we struck one last match. This time, it stayed lit. The fire came back, and as the light spread, the weight on our chests lifted. The footsteps faded. The strange symbols seemed to blur and disappear. Alex swallowed, eyes dark with memory. As soon as we could, we packed up and left without saying a word to each other. But the symbols, those shapes, those sounds, they've stayed with me. Sometimes I still see them, right when I'm falling asleep, etched in my mind. The silence around the campfire grew thick, the shadows stretching long and dark around them. The fire flickered, and for a brief moment it seemed to burn a little lower, casting a chill through the circle as if something, unseen, might be lurking just outside the firelight. Story 4. The Doll by the Tent. The group sat in tense silence, the fire crackling and casting flickering shadows over their faces. Finally, Emily, who had been quiet for most of the night, cleared her throat. She hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the circle, as if half expecting something to jump out from the shadows. "I've got one," she said, voice low. "It's strange, and I still don't fully understand it, but it happened. A couple of years ago, I was camping with friends, not too far from here actually. We thought we were alone, until we found the doll." The others leaned in, curious and unsettled. "What doll?" one of them asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a small, old-fashioned doll," Emily replied, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. Porcelain skin, cracked and yellowed with age, and wide, glassy eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. But none of us brought it with us. None of us knew where it came from. Emily's gaze became distant as she recalled the details. "The first time we saw it was just outside our tent, propped up against a tree like someone had left it there for us. Its face was chipped, and it wore this faded dress that looked like it was from a different century. We laughed it off at first, thinking maybe someone had left it behind, but something about it felt wrong, like it was watching us." She took a deep breath. "We left it where we found it and went on with our night, trying to forget about it. But the next morning, it was sitting right by the entrance of our tent. At first, I thought one of my friends was trying to mess with me. I laughed and asked who'd moved it, but they all swore they hadn't touched it. So we tossed it farther into the woods, thinking we'd gotten rid of it." The campers around the fire exchanged uneasy glances. Emily continued, her tone dropping to a near whisper. "But every time we turned around, there it was again, closer than before. We tried moving it multiple times, into the bushes, behind trees, even down by the creek, but it always came back, sitting just outside the tent, staring at us with those big, unblinking eyes. Emily's voice grew more urgent, her hands clenched in her lap as she recalled the turning point of the night. By then, everyone was on edge, and we were starting to panic. One of my friends, Alex, finally snapped and grabbed the doll, saying we'd just get rid of it once and for all. He threw it straight into the campfire. We watched as the flames engulfed it, the dress catching first, then its face slowly cracking and blackening in the heat. The fire crackled louder, almost like it was alive, devouring the doll. The campers sat in stunned silence as Emily finished, her voice barely above a whisper. That was it for us. We grabbed what we could carry and ran. We didn't pack up, we didn't look back. We just ran. I have no idea what happened to that tent or anything else we left behind. But that doll, it's haunted me ever since. Sometimes even now, I swear I catch glimpses of it from the corner of my eye, just for a split second, and when I do, it's always watching. The group shifted uncomfortably, each one glancing into the darkness beyond the fire's glow, half expecting to see a pale, cracked face staring back. Emily's story lingered, casting a chill over the campsite, as though something unseen was listening, waiting just out of sight. The fire sputtered, a sudden gust of wind sweeping through the trees, and for a moment they could almost believe they heard the faint sound of porcelain scraping against the ground, inching closer. Story 5. The Lost Path. The night was growing late and the campfire had dimmed to a soft amber glow. The campers huddled closer, the firelight casting shadows that flickered ominously against the encroaching darkness. Tom, the friend who had so far remained silent, finally broke the quiet. "All right," he began, his voice low and steady. "This is one I haven't told anyone else. It happened right here in these woods 2 summers ago. I went for a little night walk and almost didn't make it back." The others leaned in, the sounds of the forest, distant rustles and the soft hoot of an owl, seeming to fade as he continued. "I had decided to go explore, just a short walk around the camp," Tom explained, looking off into the shadows. "The trail was clear and the moon was bright that night, so I thought I'd be fine. I just wanted a bit of space and a little adventure, you know? But the path was straightforward, at least it seemed that way. I had gone down it only a few hours earlier, and I knew it shouldn't take more than 15, maybe 20 minutes tops." He paused, his face tightening, but after a while I started realizing I was turned around. Every tree looked the same, and I kept ending up back at this one spot, a twisted oak with strange marks carved into its bark. I thought maybe I'd somehow missed a turn, so I started backtracking, but no matter which direction I went, I'd end up back at that same oak. He looked at his friends, his eyes wide. That's when I started noticing symbols. They were carved into the bark of random trees, symbols I hadn't noticed before. Triangles, spirals, lines that seemed to twist and form strange, almost human-like shapes. I didn't remember seeing them when I'd first set out, and yet there they were, as if someone or something had left them just for me. Tom's voice grew tense as he continued, his words tumbling out faster now. "After what felt like hours, I started to panic. I knew I was close to camp, but I just couldn't find my way back. My phone had no signal, and every direction seemed to lead me in a circle, back to that same twisted oak." His eyes darted around the circle, searching each face as if for reassurance. Just when I was about to lose hope, I saw a figure in the distance. It was dark, and I couldn't make out who or what it was, but I felt a strange sense of relief. I called out, desperate, but the figure didn't react. It just stood there, watching me. I yelled louder, but it just turned slowly and started walking away, deeper into the forest. Tom swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper now. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to follow it. It was almost like I didn't have a choice. I stumbled after it, calling out, but it stayed just out of reach, always turning a corner or slipping behind a tree before I could get a good look. And the whole time, those strange symbols kept appearing on the trees around me, like I was walking into some kind of maze. His voice dropped, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Finally, I stopped. I realized that if I kept following, I'd never get back. So I forced myself to turn around and walk in the opposite direction. And somehow, as I walked, the symbols began to fade, the trees seeming to shift and open up, almost guiding me back to the path I recognized. That's when I saw our fire flickering in the distance. I ran, half expecting something to grab me from behind. Tom paused, his expression unreadable, then exhaled slowly. When I finally stumbled back into camp, I was exhausted, like I'd been walking for hours. But according to my friends, I'd only been gone for about half an hour. He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but it didn't feel like I was alone in those woods. It felt like something was watching, waiting, like the forest itself was shifting around me. The group sat in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Each of them felt an unspoken tension, a shared unease that seemed to rise from the shadows beyond the firelight. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a fleeting moment, they could almost hear voices, faint and distant, echoing through the forest, as if calling them to wander deeper, to become lost in the dark woods themselves. As the last story of the night faded into the stillness of the forest, an uneasy silence enveloped the group. The laughter that had accompanied their storytelling seemed to dissipate, replaced by an unsettling tension. Each friend shifted uncomfortably, casting anxious glances into the dark expanse beyond the warm glow of the campfire. The once cozy ambience had morphed into something foreboding, as if the forest itself had listened closely, taking note of their shared fears and tales. "Wow, that was intense." One friend finally broke the silence, his voice shaky. "I thought we were just camping for fun." But the nervous chuckles that followed were strained, underscoring a growing discomfort. It was as if the campfire's flickering flames were now the only thing holding back the darkness that loomed beyond. Each of them felt it, the sensation of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking just outside their circle of light. Just as the tension began to fade and they started to relax, a piercing silence cut through the air. Sarah, who had been sitting on the edge of the circle, suddenly stood up, her expression shifting from one of unease to outright alarm. "Guys, look at this." She pointed to a nearby tree, and the group turned to see what had captured her attention. There, etched into the bark, was a symbol, one that had appeared in multiple stories told that night. The same triangular shape with swirling lines that had haunted their imaginations was now starkly present, etched into the very fabric of their surroundings. "Very funny. Who did this?" Someone laughed nervously, trying to deflect the growing sense of dread that was creeping back in. But laughter faded into uncertainty as each friend exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke up to claim responsibility for the carving. "I thought we were all just telling stories. Nobody said anything about carving trees," Tom murmured, his earlier bravado replaced by apprehension. "What if it's just a prank?" Mike suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. The laughter that had once filled the air now felt hollow, as they all considered the implications of the symbol's presence. As the chill of the night deepened, the group hastily extinguished the fire, the dying embers casting eerie shadows that danced along the forest floor. They retreated to their tents, a sense of urgency propelling their movements. The once inviting campsite felt like a trap, the dark woods surrounding them, swallowing the light and amplifying their fears. They zipped their tents tightly, the fabric feeling like a flimsy barrier against the secrets lurking in the night. The forest whispered around them, the wind rustling through the leaves as if sharing hushed secrets. They huddled in their sleeping bags, hearts racing, straining to listen to the sounds outside. Was it just the wind, or were those whispers? Did they really hear footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, or was it just their imagination running wild? The air grew heavier, filled with a sense of foreboding that clung to their skin. In the oppressive silence of their tents, a subtle sound began to emerge, a soft and haunting whisper that seemed to drift through the fabric walls. The friends exchanged anxious glances, the weight of unspoken fear hanging in the air. The whispers grew louder, echoing faintly around them, as if the very trees were calling out to them, beckoning them to venture beyond their shelters. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," came the reply, equally hushed. "What is that?" Then, just beyond the tents, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, shuffling through the underbrush. The friends held their breath, the air thick with a mix of fear and adrenaline. The scene faded into darkness, leaving the audience to wonder if something truly sinister was lurking just beyond the firelight, watching and waiting. Were they merely victims of their own imagination, or had they unwittingly drawn the attention of something ancient and malevolent that haunted the woods? The answers lay hidden in the shadows, tantalizingly out of reach, as the whispers of the forest echoed into the night.